Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'd like to add my thanks to everybody here tonight for coming out in these conditions. If you hadn't already guessed from my accent, I'm originally from England, and I'll be headed back there shortly. So I'm thinking this is perhaps preparation after Southern California for a British winter. I'd just like to begin by saying a few words about how first I came to this subject before describing some of the themes of the book. Now, as you've already heard, my previous book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, was about CIA front groups in the early years of the Cold War. These are apparently private non-government organizations made up of anti-communist private citizens engaged in Cold War propaganda overseas. It later emerged that these groups were in fact being secretly funded and to some extent managed by the CIA. Now, one group I didn't really engage with in The Mighty Wurlitzer was the American Friends of the Middle East. Mainly because its purpose didn't seem to be so much to do with the Cold War as with promoting the Arab world to an American audience, and also it was anti-Zionist, battling the influence of the emerging Israel lobby in 1950s America. And this just seems so sort of odd and unexpected to me. I didn't really quite know what to do with it, so I mentioned it in The Mighty Wurlitzer, but sort of put the American Friends of the Middle East to one side, as it were. After The Mighty Wurlitzer, though, I came back to this story and began sort of delving into it further, and soon realized that the main officer, the main CIA officer involved in the creation of the American Friends of the Middle East was none other than Kermit Kim Roosevelt. Now, this name might already be familiar to you before this evening because he is known as the CIA officer who led the 1953 coup operation in Iran that toppled the nationalist government of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the rule of the Shah. And also, as we've just heard, Kim Roosevelt was sort of an American aristocrat. He was a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and head of the CIA, an early head of the CIA's Middle East division, thus his field command of the 1953 coup, which of course is a sort of inside it as a classic case of blowback, right? It might have averted a Cold War crisis at the time, but it led to later to years of U.S. Iranian hostility. So I guess right away, even before I started out, I had really two questions. First of which was, what was the CIA doing funding this pro-Arab anti-Zionist group? Not perhaps what one would expect the CIA to be doing. And why was Kim Roosevelt the enemy of, or a man known as the enemy of nationalism in Iran? Why was he backing this group, which among other things advocated for Arab nationalists like the Egyptian Gamal Nasser? Well, I did a lot of research in government records. Not so much the CIA's own records, because they either remain classified or have been destroyed. But if you sort of snoop around in other record groups, especially those of the State Department, and also go to British public records as well, you can learn a surprising amount of information about CIA operations in this period. Also, collections of private papers and interviews with surviving intelligence officers of the day and family members of my main characters. What emerged from this research was an account of the CIA in the 1940s and 1950s, and this is at the moment really of the birth of the CIA. It comes into existence in 1947, and this is also really the beginning of official U.S. involvement in the Middle East. There's been very little official U.S. presence there prior to this period. So what emerged was this history of the CIA in the Middle East during these crucial decades, but with at its core, Kermit Roosevelt. It's partly a biography of Kermit Roosevelt, but it's a group biography. It also includes Archie Roosevelt, Kermit's cousin, another grandson of TR, and this somewhat colourful, rambunctious personality from a very different background from the aristocratic Roosevelt cousins. Miles Copeland, he's from the South, from Alabama. Compared with the Roosevelts, I guess, from the sort of the wrong side of the tracks, and he later becomes this very sort of indiscreet, garrulous commentator after he's left the agency on intelligence affairs. He's also somewhat improbably the father of Stuart Copeland, drummer for the Police, in case you didn't know that. Together, these three men, Archie and Kermit Roosevelt and Miles Copeland, really helped shape the CIA's early program in the Middle East. And as Kim Roosevelt's involvement in the Iran coup of 1953 perhaps suggests, this involved creating quite a lot of disorder in the Middle East, various attempts at various coup operations and attempts at coups that left a legacy of anti-Americanism that still troubles U.S. relations with the region today. But at the same time, these men were Arabists. That is, they knew a great deal about the Arab world, and they were surprisingly sympathetic towards it, sincerely believed that they had its best interest at heart. So what this book attempts to do is capture this perhaps surprising moment when the CIA was most definitely pro-Arab, and ask where did this impulse come from, this Arabist impulse come from, and where did it go? Why did it eventually become eclipsed by other impulses in US foreign policy? Well, just to sort of sketch the answers to these questions which emerge from my research. First, as to where this Arabism originated, well, to some extent it came from the British, who were, of course, the dominant Western power in the Middle East prior to the US's entry into the region in the early years of the Cold War. The Roosevelt cousins in particular were captivated by the example of earlier British Arabists, in particular T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. They both they both grew up reading his account of his involvement in World War I, the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Kim Roosevelt's father actually knew Lawrence personally and corresponded with him. So they imbibed this sort of tradition of the romantic British attraction towards the Arabs. But this was also where the concept of the Great Game came in. In addition to Lawrence, they read Rudyard Kipling, the bard, the British bard of the British Empire, and the author of Kim, this adventure story about a young Anglo-Indian spy in India, the time of the Raj, which it really shaped Kermit Roosevelt's childhood in particular, his imagination in his childhood, and it's where his nickname of Kim, which stuck with him through his adult life, came from. And I think it's from this British influence that the Roosevelt cousins in particular get this notion of the Middle East, the East generally, the Orient, as this sort of place of potential adventure for heroic espionage games. But this isn't the only influence on them. I think it's also important to realize that there was another tradition on which they drew, a distinctively American one, and it was a sort of non-official one. It's the legacy left by a generation of American missionaries in the Middle East. Missionaries that first started going to the Arab world in the early 1800s, hadn't succeeded in converting many of the non-Christian